Hi, this is Dennis Dalton, the safety officer for the Peterson Aero Club, and this is the presentation safety meeting for May 25th. Today's presentation is going to be on aircraft accidents. It's the little things that matter. As all of you know by now, this recent mid-air collision was very fortunate, and that no one was injured. While the GA safety record has improved over the years, this recent tragic event underscores the importance of revisiting all too common scenarios that underlie aircraft accidents. And of course, on the left, one of the widely circulated images of the Key Lime Air that released a statement to CBS4, which reads in part, Key Lime Air has received confirmed reports that on May 12, 2021, at approximately 10:20 a.m. Mountain Time, one of our cargo aircraft, a Fairchild Metroliner, was on approach to landing at Centennial when it was struck by another aircraft. Amazing that he was able to put that down. I know on my plane there's quite a few things up in the ceiling there, like the trim tab cables for one. So now we have on the right, before the crash, air traffic control could be heard asking Cirrus 6 Delta Joliet, I can't read the rest of it since my head is in front of it, do you require assistance? So while I don't want to comment on these as it's undergoing investigation by the NTSB, I just thought it was an interesting lead into this month's discussion. We'll look at 3 aircraft accidents in this safety presentation involving Cessna 172 aircraft similar to our T-41s. In fact, one of them is a T-41 in Colorado, and what could be learned from the NTSB reports. Unlike the Metroliner Cirrus accident, all 3 of these accidents involved wind, which was the main causal factor in the accidents. The first report is a taxi accident at Front Range, FTG, formerly Front Range, now the KCFO Colorado Air and Spaceport, involving an Aero Club aircraft, one of ours. I'll just refer to it as Front Range in the report. I'm not going to say formerly and now, Air and Spaceport again. The second report's a takeoff accident at the Air Force Academy, and the third's a landing at KCOS. So I picked these 3 feeling that since they were all very local, and most people here are familiar either with that airplane accident, some of you who've been around that long, or you know the situation at Colorado Springs or at the Air Force Academy, that these would have more interest and could spark some comment or discussion in the live presentation. Unfortunately, in this presentation of the YouTube, it's a one-sided presentation. So while there's no perfect method for determining the maximum wind and gust factor you should fly into, here are a few things we should take into consideration. Now, these group of things here, let me get my pointer out here real quick. There you go. These few things right here, I got them off of the AOPA website, and I will, in the 3 accident reports, as I have a discussion area in there, and what I will do is pull things from this group that I feel are relative or relevant to that accident and talk about it. So it won't be all of them in every one, but you see, because total gust factor, which was an element in all of them, which we will discuss more at length, which most of you are familiar with, which is, first of all, the difference between steady wind and the gust, and what to do about that, depending on the situation and the direction. Runway condition really didn't factor in as much in any of these accidents, and that would be, a wet runway, snowy runway, slippery, or a rough runway, such as there are a few mountain runways, or dirt is another one. Wind condition, wind direction, and runway direction. That does figure in almost all of these accidents, especially when you get to taxiing, which is referred to in the wind direction component of that. Runway length and width. Runways in these accidents vary between, I think the one at the Air Force Academy, they weren't specific, and I'll get into that, but they have a 40-foot wide runway, but most of them, the other ones are all 75, and that's probably where that was. The other one, of course, at KCOS was 150, so those are a consideration when you're over to Springs East. That runway is very narrow, and you can get to the edge of that runway quite quickly if you do not use proper control techniques. Recency of experience appears to have figured in, although it was not specifically pointed out in any of the NTSB findings. Airplane size, where I mention it personally in one of the accidents, I don't feel that really is as relevant in this case, since they're all 172s. Manufacturer's limitations were exceeded in all three accidents. And I've been guilty of this. Most of all, avoid the temptation of using other pilots' success as an indicator of safety. Here's an interesting picture here where you'd say, well, is he taking off or landing? I see a little puff of smoke right here, which means that'd be hard to do when you're taking off. So he's landing, and of course a wheel landing I find as a tail dragger pilot, a rusty tail dragger pilot. Wheel landings are the most challenging, and I remember when I learned in a Citabria and also flew decathlons, that was the most challenging to me, and the only way to land these things if it's windy, and you got to land them wind high wheel and hold it there. And so it's basically always a 3-point landing, which we will talk about that in relationship to tricycle gear as well. Okay, the first report's the wordiest one, so I will just read this here, this NTSB report 1, 27th of February 2012. All of these are right around this time period of about 2011, 2012. The 172 Echo, that's one of ours, 3196 Foxtrot, nosed over during taxi to runway 17 for takeoff at Front Range near Denver. Private pilot, I'll just put this over here. Private pilot sustained minor injuries. The airplane sustained substantial damage to the wing and vertical stabilizer. The airplane was registered to the United States Air Force and was operated by the USAF Peterson Aero Club under Provision 14 Code Federal Regulations 91 business flight. Visual meteorological conditions prevailed. Flight plan was filed. Flight was originating in time of accident. Pilot stated that he filed a flight plan and dispatched the airplane as he had done in the past. Okay, flight from COS to FTG was uneventful. When landing at FTG, and there's no time here, he noticed the wind began to gust. He taxied to the ramp where the engine was shut down and the airplane was tied down. So then at 10:35, he checks the winds and noticed the winds are from a southerly direction and runway 17 was in use. The pilot stated that the FTG Automatic Terminal Information Service reported winds as 160 at 27, gusts 3.8. During a taxi on taxiway A, they say here taxiway A is an east taxiway, and I will show you the taxi diagram in a minute. To runway 17, the airplane tail lifted upward and then airplane nosed over. The winds at FTG were recorded at 10:43, which is about less than 10 minutes later at 170, 30 gusts 43. That's spirited, in my opinion, and depending, again, as I would say, depending on the plane, for sure. It's not too much for some, and we will talk about that, but certain planes have their limitations. According to the Rocky Mountain USAF Flight Training Center SOPs, Section 5, wind operating limits. Maximum crosswind for pilots with less than 200 hours is 10 knots. For those with more than 200 hours, maximum crosswind was flight manual demonstrated crosswind component. The R172E manual says maximum allowable crosswind velocities dependent on pilot capability rather than airplane limitations. However, with average pilot technique, duress crosswinds can be handled safely. The pilot reported a total time of 1,400 hours, of which 100 were in single engine, 50 in make and model. So obviously, let's see what I came up with here. Let's see what they said. Well, first of all, I will go back to this in a minute, but this is the layout at FTG. And here's A. My guess, I'm guessing, is not in the report. He was on the ramp somewhere, although I think Bob probably knows this one. I can't remember. I believe I was here at that time, and because I remember that call number, but I'm sure Bob knows this problem intimately here. And it would seem to me that once he got past the protection of these buildings, he might have dumped it right here because the wind was coming up this way, and he didn't even make it to Charlie Bravo and down to here. So that's a lot of right turns with that kind of wind. And there's not a lot of cover out there either. But in any event, NTSB probable cause the pilot's improper decision to taxi in wind conditions that exceeded the airplane's capability. So what I do is in each three of these, as I said before, is I'll bring up a couple graphics and talk about things that I would have said to a student about it. And again, in a live presentation, I'm sure with the expertise in the audience, and especially with this particular accident, that there would be a lot more to be said about people who were there at the time and in charge. I picked airplane size. Gusts were within 10 knots of the T-41 rotation speed. So that's something to really be watching out for. I thought that could be something. Wind direction and runway direction. Well, the application of proper flight control placement for crosswind taxi technique while taxiing may have helped. But with a right crosswind of over 40 knots, it could have exceeded the ability of the airplane to remain upright. And you know what? I have trouble sometimes backing this presentation up. It doesn't seem to want to do that. But so I'm glad I discussed the runway taxi relationship earlier before I went to this slide. So in any event, that's right. Okay, manufacturer's limitations. These are outlined in the recent report in addition to the club SOP guidelines. So what I wanted to talk about here, this is a very wordy diagram here. Obviously, most of you, if not all of you, know that these arrows mean the wind is coming from this direction. And they give a lot of wordy things here. I'm assuming this is a nose wheel tricycle gear airplane because they're using neutral elevator. And I'll explain that in a minute. When taxiing and the wind is from the left in front of you, and usually it's the wing division line here. And if the wind is coming right around in this area, it's your call, right? Because whether you're using this technique or this technique, and it's usually quite a matter of seat of the pants feel. But you know, if the wind's coming from up here, they say up aileron on left wing and neutral elevator. That's a lot of, I think, visualization, which is difficult to learn and difficult to understand. So I use the word into. So in other words, I want to turn the plane or bank the plane into the wind. Now, if the wind is here, it's neutral elevator. So if the wind is anywhere in front of you and it's in this half of the quadrant, it's neutral elevator, bank into the wind. If it's over here, it's neutral elevator, bank into the wind this way. That is a lot easier to remember. Here, down aileron, right wing, down, that's a lot to remember. So if you're back here and you're getting quartering tailwind, as they call these, that means you dive away from. Down elevator means dive. So you're diving away from, so you dive to the left. If the wind's coming from over here, you dive to the right. So I use words like climb, I use words like neutral elevator into, dive away from. Okay, so the next shoe that's going to drop here is, well, what if this is a tail dragger? Well, I don't fly a tail dragger, I know, but if you did, these would be even more important, but they do change just a little bit. Because of the center of gravity of a tail dragger, climb into and dive away from. So climb into is the only different one for tail draggers. Otherwise, the taxi is the same, except most of the time what you want to do in a tail dragger, and this is not a tail dragger class really, but the stick is all the way back. You want to keep that tail on the ground. You do not want it up. And so it's on the ground all the time until that airplane gets rolling. So that is a tricky situation, because if you have a quartering tailwind, you've got to watch out what you're doing here, because you can't really, you don't want to lift, you know. So anyway, I'm just pointing out the differences there. Okay, so I think that in that first report, if the idea is using proper taxiing control placement for windy conditions for tricycle gear airplane is first. Secondly, not to exceed the limits of the airplane. I was pointing out the times on that last one because I would have been getting nervous. I don't know what time the guy left, but it can get a little blustery up there. I probably would have checked the winds. 40 is kind of aggressive. You know, I mean, if it was going to be that, I would have known it before I left. And I don't know how long I'd be sitting around on the ground waiting for it to get windier. So that's just me. Okay, number 2. 24th of March 2012 at the Air Force Academy, a P model. The pilot reported that he rotated the airplane at 55 knots. Okay, it immediately started to drift. He heard the stall warning horn, so he lowered the nose. The airplane subsequently impacted the ground. He pulled the throttle to idle. The airplane was approaching the crossing runway, and there was a hump or ditch near the runway edge. He pulled back the controls to avoid the obstacle, which means he's probably near the edge, I guess, or heading to the edge. And the airplane became airborne and climbed about 10 or 15 feet above the ground. The airplane landed hard and bounced, probably, stalled again. The nose landing gear caught in the dirt. The airplane nosed over, which resulted in substantial damage to the airframe. The pilot reported that there was no mechanical malfunction or failure of the airplane. The pilot reported the wind during takeoff was slightly from the right at 9 knots, gusting to 13. NTSB probable cause: the pilot did not maintain control of the airplane during takeoff, which resulted in a hard landing and subsequent nose over. Well, total gust factor would be one of the matrices I went right for on this one. Maintaining an airspeed that factored in a gust factor based on pilot experience could have prevented the airplane approaching a takeoff stall speed. In other words, takeoff with a little extra speed, and we will talk about that. And also, but it isn't takeoff as much as what are you climbing out of ground effect in. And ground effect, as you remember, is a very even curved graph that is extremely efficient in canceling or in increasing lift within a third, 25 to 30% of the wing diameter. And once you get to half, it reduces it a lot more. And then when you get up to a full wingspan, it's gone, that extra lift. So even getting off the ground is fine, as we talked about in the last one, but getting out of ground effect is not. And had the pilot kept it in ground effect, it is possible to gain airspeed in order to climb. They did not talk about temperature being a factor. I forgot about what time of year that was, or time of day was not indicated. Wind direction and runway direction. The airplane was drifting off the runway. The aileron into the wind with appropriate rudder to keep the airplane in line with the runway center could have helped this situation. I do have a chart or graph or image to show you in the next slide. Runway length and width, reported indicated pilot was close to the, as it says under there, edge of the runway due to drift. The report does not indicate which runway was being used or the magnetic wind direction. As I said earlier in this introduction, the widest runways are 75 feet at KAFF from my research. KAFF, not being public airport, it's not easy to get images and info off of that one. Recency of experience could have been a factor, considering 9 gust 13 was a problem. That speed exceeds our Aero Club student solo wind speed of 10 knots crosswind. What you have here is the, right from the FAA, the old-time drawings here. There's not a lot of color in it. What does this say? Apply full aileron into the wind, rudder as needed for direction. I don't know how many times with a crosswind, took off with the controls fully deflected towards the wind. Some students between this scenario and this one are extremely nervous about that, thinking the airplane's going to flip over. Well, the airplane's not really moving. And the more that the wind is over the control surfaces, the more effective the controls become. So they get more effective here and more effective here. So as they get more effective, you have to take out some of that deflection. So simply in this FAA old-time picture, they just say full aileron into the wind. The next one is hold aileron into the wind, roll on upwind wheel. That's right. Because as soon as the ailerons become effective, the airplane will start to tilt, and you need rudder as needed to keep the fuselage straight, and you will end up with the downwind wheel lifting off the ground and taking off on one wheel, which is what you're doing on a takeoff roll. If you do not do that, it definitely will chatter its way right across the runway to the the downwind side of the runway. And if it's a narrow runway, you will end up on the edge, which is what happened in this case. Holding aileron into the wind, bang into the wind, rudder as needed. So you're still doing this scenario here, only maybe a little less, maybe not, maybe back and forth. But you're going to take off on one wheel. You're up on one wheel here, and you're going to stay there until it takes off. As soon as it takes off, you level wings and crab into the wind. So immediately letting go of everything, you'll turn in maybe whatever it was, 10 degrees left into the wind or whatever. That is the proper technique for taking off in the wind. If you don't do that, it will push, as soon as the airplane gets light and the wings begin to produce lift, it will take that airplane and it will chatter right off to the left, which is exactly what happened. NTSB Factual Report number 3, 3rd of April, 2011. 172N at KCOS, April, springtime, like now. As the pilot returned to the local airport, the airport tower controller confirmed him of a storm cell approaching the airfield. Issued a clearance to land and reported winds from 70 degrees left of runway heading. 70 degrees, that's pretty far off. At 25 knots, gusting 34. I don't know if I'd have taken that runway for that with that. The pilot, that's just me. The pilot estimated the winds at 18 knots of crosswind. I'm not sure if that means he calculated that or what he was thinking there, unless he was crabbing into it and that was his crab angle. And landed using 40 degrees of flaps. Okay. While on landing roll, the airplane experienced a shift in winds to a tailwind, at which time the airplane began to drift to the right side of the 150-foot wide runway. The pilot attempted to go around, but could not regain control of the airplane. He then elected to abort the go-around and attempted to bring the airplane to a stop. The airplane departed the right side of the runway and continued into a field. The airplane encountered uneven terrain and the airplane nosed over. Substantial damage was sustained to the airplane's wings and vertical stabilizer. The pilot reported no pre-impact malfunctions with the airplane. A review of air traffic control transmissions revealed the pilot was aware of alerts for low-level wind shear and microbursts during his local flight. The airplane's operating handbook directs pilots to utilize the minimum flap setting required for field length while operating in strong crosswinds. Well, with a 172 and a 2-mile-long runway, I think the minimum flap setting is 0. In addition to the handbook does not state a maximum allowable crosswind velocity, but states the average pilot technique should be able to handle 15 knots of crosswind. Winds at times during this landing were between 23 and 32 knots of crosswind, not 18. Sounds like his estimate was half of what this is. Well, here's a microburst. Probable cause, the pilot's loss of directional control during landing in gusty crosswind conditions. When these are alerts, most of you, if not all of you, have seen this depiction here, and they have the airplane, little silhouettes of the airplane in the test, and they say, is he going to get a downdraft or an updraft? Yeah, and who knows where. So let's talk about this. Gust factor was one of the elements in this particular accident. A 10-knot gust was present with wind shear alerts. That would mean to be on the alert for shifting winds and stronger gusts. From my point of view, be ready for a go around at any second. I would have had my hand on that throttle and never took it off. It appears from the wording in the report, and I would have had extra speed in there. It appears from the wording in the report, attempt to go around was too late. If he's already blowing them sideways, the only thing you can do is nose it over and apply full throttle and hold it down there and ground effect to get some speed. If you try and climb or you don't put the power in fast enough, it's just going down. Wind direction and runway direction, the same concern as gust factors. It was too big of a wind cut, too strong of a crosswind. Recency of experience. Experience with microbursts would mean minimum flaps or no flaps, in my opinion. If I had microbursts and a really, really short runway, I don't think I would be trying to do it. 2 strikes, you're out, I guess. The pilot may not have had sufficient experience with microburst gusts, deploying full flaps instead of the minimum flap setting required for gusty situations. People that use full flaps all the time without thinking aren't thinking about this. As an instructor, I'd say that's, as a private pilot, you have to learn to land with no flaps and partial flaps, and you should practice that on a regular basis. I think. I do. Airplane size. Extra caution is always required in gusty situations, especially if the pilot is used to flying heavier aircraft. And if I'm going to put stuff in the right corner here, I'm going to have to quit doing that because I'm reading off of this slide and I can't read this. Manufacturer's limitations. Reported crosswind at the time of the accident was 23 to 32 knots, which exceeded the manufacturer's recommendation for this aircraft. Of 15 knots, although it says pilot limitations or pilot experience can help that out, but only to a certain point. What bothers me the most about microbursts is the fact that those winds are extremely strong, and if you get in this one here, I will relate one brief story. It's not real exciting. I was flying the other end of the field for Mike Hogan at Ascent Aviation years ago. We were on final 17 right, microbursts in the area. We were on final doing 80 knots. We had no flaps or 10 degrees of flaps. We couldn't get down. We got down to about 500 feet. Power was off. We were about a quarter mile out. Power was off. I left the flaps the way they were. That airplane wouldn't go down. It finally was, we were trying to coax it down, but as soon as you tried to make it go down, it would go faster. So we're at 500 feet, and that thing was doing 110 with the power off, and I was all the way down to Alpha 6. And I said, you know, there's something behind us here, and that's not happening. So it's very powerful. That just pushed you 2 miles there. So it wasn't an exciting story, but it was a, you know, it made me realize the power of these things if you get into them one way or another, and it's not something to mess around with. It's clear from these reports that gusty conditions are to be treated with respect. Personal experience and personal limits should be evaluated by every pilot at every new challenge. Let's just review quickly what the AOPA has compiled on the subject of wind. According to AOPA's NAW report, nearly 40% of fixed gear single engine accidents are on landing. I could also add takeoff to that, I suppose. And in the majority of those accidents, wind is a factor. We've all flown on days when the METAR says something like this. Here's one from BJC, 290, 12 gust 25. Depending on what runways are available, how often you fly, and what kind of airplane you're in, 13 knots of gust is not an unreasonable challenge. Every pilot will have a different comfort level when it comes to landing in gusty conditions. Usually, the solution is to add half the gust factor to your final approach speed. Wind gusts can be variable and unpredictable, which are two things you never want to deal with when you're landing. When you fly on a gusty day, you know that your airspeed indicator can have some pretty wild fluctuations, which that's very true. And I rarely well, you can if you're giving a pilot report, because that's what you would do. And they do encourage that at those times, by the way, if I can insert that. And you can say plus or minus, you know, 5 knots, 7 knots, 10 knots. And you do hear those things from the commercial people saying the same thing. And of course, they have different considerations and with turbines. And we have a little better recovery time with a small prop, but you don't have the power. If you're on speed or a little low on final approach, a sudden loss in headwind from a gust could get you closer to the stall speed than you would like to be. When you're dealing with a gusty day, the FAA recommends you add half the gust factor to your final approach speed. I don't always feel that that's enough. I mean, if it's gusting 13 and I'm adding 5 and the airspeed indicator's moving all over the map, I might add a little more myself. Now you say, well, how much? It's, you know, again, those are calls based on experience, but a little more is better. I mean, but again, it's following the rules is following the rules. Half the gust factor minimum. I think in a couple of those instances, not the taxi, but the other two, if they'd have religiously put in some extra speed and had a little more knowledge of how to use the controls properly, those accidents could have been avoided. It is those little things that matter. That's the end of this presentation. This is Dennis Dalton, Safety Officer for Peterson Aero Club.